And stress isn't the problem, right? It's chronic habituated stress that's the problem. And it's the inability to relax and integrate that stress that's the problem. Stress in and of itself is actually very healthy. I like to stress myself consistently. And I like to relax. And so, if we're using survival energy, and if we're using rhythms of breath that are meant for escape or that are meant for very small bursts, and we're using that throughout an extended period of time, the system is going to have a deep imbalance. And what is going to be required is for it to rebalance. And that's typically overachievement into burnout, which we see in a lot of leaders, CEOs, execs, founders. And what I've come to realize is if I wanted to build this organization to the depth and scale that I envision in the world, I needed to relax. And I needed to take time for me, and I needed to take time out. And that's a continued practice.
Welcome to the Heart of Man podcast, a podcast for any man seeking to live in alignment with his deepest core and lead a life of profound meaning and connection. I'm your host, Alex Lehman, and I'm here to empower you through transformative conversations, eye-opening insights, and practical wisdom. Join me now as we venture into the heart of man. Let's dive in. How we breathe is how we think. It was this very sentence that was shared with me on the first ever Breathwork circle that I was a part of. And it was this journey that forever changed the course of my life. And with these words, I'd like to welcome our next guest on the podcast, Edward Dangerfield. Edward is a nervous system specialist, teacher, and the visionary founder of the facilitated breath repatterning technique and Breathwork Bali. Edward's journey of transformation began after surviving a near-death experience where he found himself caught in an avalanche. This event left him grappling with the aftermath of post-traumatic stress disorder, bringing him down a journey of seeking the tools and practices that can help him heal and regulate his nervous system. On his path of exploring various healing modalities, he was eventually introduced to the power of conscious connected breathwork, and he never looked back. With a deep commitment of supporting others, he has since dedicated himself to helping individuals feel at home within their bodies by claiming the power of their own breath. My intention with this conversation was to go beyond the realm of breathwork to discuss Edward's life and perspectives outside of his work. I was especially interested in going into depth on the topic of relationship with the intention to expand beyond the limited perspectives we may have been conditioned into. And one of the core messages that we seem to have constantly come back to was the importance of being in a relationship to everything and having a balance between relating to ourselves and a wider community. Having personally undergone Edward's 400-hour facilitator training and forming a deep friendship with him over the last years, I'm incredibly excited to share this conversation with you. Edward's wisdom and insights have profoundly impacted my life. I have no doubt that they'll touch yours as well. Edward Dangerfield, welcome to the Heart of Man podcast. How are you feeling today?
Thanks so much, bro. Yeah. Feeling really good. Feeling a lot of things. Very present, grounded, very open in my heart today, which I think comes from waking up with my 4-year-old son in my bed, which was super fun.
Wow.
And yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation today as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, what a beautiful as well image to have to wake up with your 4-year-old son today. That is definitely something I want to get into with you today.
Yeah.
This topic of fatherhood.
Thank you.
And the thing I want to just speak into is as well for me this level of joy and excitement that's present, but then as well a level of groundedness, considering we've had so many of these conversations in our own way, and it feels like such an enriching experience to actually come into a studio and have as well other people be part of a conversation that we have. So, and I'm excited really to go into all kinds of topics. One of the intentions that we have for sure is to speak into the topic of relationship. But before we get into that, I want to just preface a little bit for the audience who you are. And yeah, I just want to speak into, you're the founder of Breathwork Bali. You're a teacher of the breath, or a modality called facilitated breath repatterning. And you've taught numerous practitioners now who are all across the world by now into this modality. And there's all kinds of beautiful, fun, interesting things happening down here in Bali, as well with a lab that has now opened up about a year ago. So there's a lot of interesting things in the making. And from what I know about you, I recognize this has been a journey of getting here.
Yeah.
A journey of, I believe, over than 10 years. And the thing I want to just maybe start off with is how you got here. And perhaps you can share with us this defining moment, I'm going to call it this breakdown moment that really brought you on a path to finding the breath.
Yeah, thank you, bro. Well, let's just dive straight into that breakdown moment. There was one critical breakdown moment, which was being caught in an avalanche, which was about 10 years ago. Like, yeah, I think it's pretty much like bang on a decade now. Probably a decade and a month. So yeah, that was this incredible time when my life took a totally different turn. And essentially what happened was easy to look back on it now with a little bit more clarity, but it was a near-death experience. So yeah, I was skiing in the mountains in Canada. I was in what we call the backcountry, so that's out of the avalanche controlled area. And it had been a pretty good snowfall the night before, with a wind that had loaded a lot of snow onto certain aspects or certain faces, so certain sides of the mountain. And yeah, I dropped in to ski some out-of-bounds terrain that I'd skied, probably like 200-300 times before. So I was very familiar with the terrain, but that day there was a particular kind of cluster of events that came together that led the mountain to slide. And so it wasn't what we would classify in avalanche terms as huge. It was a class 2, which is enough to bury a person. And so, yeah, I went for a bit of a ride. I went for a ride down a mountainside for probably about 70 or 80 meters. I was ragdolled and tumbled. And essentially I was fighting in the snow to keep my head above for like 60, 70 meters.
Wow.
And when the avalanche set or came to a stop, I was buried up to my neck. So I could still breathe. Thankfully, not a full burial, which probably would have led potentially to suffocation. But I knew that I had to fight for my life to keep my head above. And I knew that if I didn't do that, if I got buried under, I'd probably have maybe 6, maybe 7 minutes of air around me in reasonably soft packed snow for my companion to dig me out. So they would have to locate me under the snow using an avalanche transceiver, and then they would have to use a probe, which we all carry, which is basically a collapsible 3-meter rod. They would have to probe the snow to find out where my body was located, put their shovel together from their backpack, and then dig me out. Wow. And so, yeah, all of that was kind of going through my mind as I'm like being ragdolled by an incredibly large amount of snow, which is really heavy. And so, yeah, when I came to a set, as it were, buried up to my neck, there wasn't really much relief in that moment because we were still out of bounds. So we were still in the backcountry. And there was an acknowledgement then that if one pitch had slid, then more could as well. So basically it's like, I don't know, like maybe like it's like walking on very thin glass above like, crocodiles. It's like, I knew that something else could emerge. I knew that I could be in more danger. So I never really had the opportunity to relax. So I had to get dug out, I had to get my gear, and I had to hike back in bounds. And unfortunately what happened was I never really found safety after that experience for a few weeks. So my system was revving consistently with a lot of adrenaline and cortisol, essentially as if I was still in the avalanche. And I was shaky and on edge and didn't really know what was going on. And so, yeah, being in a ski town and growing up in the UK, the natural solution to most problems is to start drinking, which is really effective at numbing, but not very effective at actually like changing any of the mechanistic behavior that was underneath what was going on. Yeah. So then a couple of weeks after that, I was lucky enough to be in connection with someone who was a somatic experiencing practitioner, an SE practitioner, who was in their training and was versed and understood in the nervous system to a reasonable degree. And I went for a session with them in Vancouver, drove down, and I knew I needed some support and help with this. And I had a session, and I relived the whole avalanche in their treatment room. I went through all of the movement patterns and reflexes. I ended up on the floor, like flailing around, and then went into this deep, deep rest and relaxation response at the end. And looking back now, for those of you that, you that are familiar, and for those of the listeners who are familiar,
Sure.
I went through a trauma cycle. So I got basically re-traumatized into the experience in a safe space, guided through it, went through the whole thing, and then went into rest afterwards.
If I can just pause you here,
Yeah.
can you speak a little bit into this trauma cycle for the people who may not be aware of this? You as well spoke into that your system has been in a threat response for numerous weeks after the avalanche has passed. So it would probably be interesting as well for listeners to know about this. And I'm sure I wonder as well if you were able to communicate that at that time, or if you just simply noticed, okay, I just noticed myself feeling very stressed right now, but maybe not really understanding the actual mechanism of what was happening in your body.
Yeah, thank you, bro. Yeah, at the time I didn't have the self-awareness to know what was really going on. I just knew I didn't feel right.
Right.
Like something had shifted. And obviously, like being caught in an avalanche, it's pretty clear that like that was the event that had done that. So that was easy in and of itself.
Right.
Also, I was living in the mountains for that point, like would have been about 15 years. So it's not uncommon for like friends or colleagues or, like other people to be caught in avalanches. Like it was something we were, trained for and used to. But I wasn't aware of what it had actually done to my system. Not on that level and depth that I would now, that I would be able to recognize and understand, a shift in breathing rhythm or a tightness in the diaphragm, that sort of thing. So yeah, I just knew like something was off. Yeah. And then so getting to the other inquiry around the trauma cycle, I mean, like in an ideal world, a human is exposed to a threat. We mobilize energy. We avoid the threat. We then go into a natural response of discharge, de-escalation, integration, relaxation, right? And so that would then be like healthy response to stimulus. The example is in Bali, an easy one is riding a scooter, having a near miss. It's like, something comes, maybe out of peripheral vision, whole body tightens, sharp inhale of breath, mobilize the steering wheel, dodge the other scooter. And then there's this opportunity of a downshift, rest, relaxation. And then maybe even we go into like, we meet our friend at a coffee shop afterwards and you're like, you never guess what happened to me. You tell the story. They're like, wow, they hold space, they support you. And then there's another wave of relief, right? So that's kind of like life. We get exposed to threat, we mobilize energy, we meet it, and then we de-escalate and integrate. Yeah.
And I've heard you as well speak into this, that the problem isn't so much that we are in a position of being put in a threat response, but rather it's much more about how do we orientate ourselves back into a level of safety. Could you speak a bit more into that?
Yeah, and so like the example I just gave you was just around like this idea of like, some connection to a friend as an example, as like in a safe space in the coffee shop that we're familiar with. And that allows us to kind of like tell the story and the narrative, and it allows us cognitively, mentally, and emotionally to sort of make sense of the experience, right? And so yeah, like life's going to happen. We're going to keep being exposed to threat, and that's part of life. Like and if we attempt to deny that, it's going to be challenging. So yeah, we have an opportunity to decide how am I going to meet these stresses, and with that also, how do I integrate my day? Maybe every day. What are my processes and protocols every day where I can reflect on what's been challenging and I can relax into that. One of the ways we do that is in relationship to other people, to our friends, to romantic partner, to our colleagues. We share challenge, and we're story and sort of vision and myth-based mammals essentially. So I think our ability to work with our physiology and our stress and survival responses, and our ability to understand that on a much more fundamental and deep level is going to allow us greater freedom of choice, both in the moment where we have a stress response that's activated, probably naturally and for good reason, and then afterwards, like in how we like deactivate and integrate that.
Yeah, and coming back as well to the experience that you had, I can imagine as well that really wasn't available to you or the case.
No. I mean, a couple things there. Like one is I was probably already quite out-resourced. And what that means is it was March. I'd already been skiing a lot, working a lot. I was in quite a challenging relationship at the time. And I was also starting to really question. I was entering into like Saturn return phase of life. I would have been like 31, 32 then. And I was starting to question like what I was actually doing and deeper meaning as well. So it was kind of a like in there somewhere over my shoulder there was an existential crisis brewing as well. So like when you kind of put all those things together and then you throw an avalanche on top, it's like I like to make the analogy that like the lid of my Pandora's box got torn off and thrown away. And then I didn't have many skills or tools and or resources or community to really navigate that very effectively.
And I'm wondering, how did you meet that initially as that arose? Because, you know, we kind of framed it as a breakdown. And the reason why I feel this is really important to speak into, as I shared as well with you before our conversation, having gone through an incredibly challenging experience myself over the past year, where I truly had an experience of breakdown where literally everything was stripped from me. Everything that I loved, I cared about, everything that I believed in. And ultimately as well, I noticed myself questioning myself at an existential level. And speaking into that or hearing that as a listener, that doesn't really sound very attractive, right?
No.
But coming out of that experience, I noticed immense value in that breakdown because it allowed me to really take a deeper look at myself and bring awareness to certain aspects of me that I wasn't aware of yet, and really bring my presence to those and finding my path into deeper alignment. So I'm wondering, how did that fit in for you? And would you say that was a similar journey that breakdown that you had led you down?
Yeah, thank you, bro. Yeah, I mean, like the lid off the box was torn off and thrown away, and it didn't get any easier. Like after that experience, I would say it didn't get any easier for probably a year. And how I navigated that was mostly through avoidance, denial, and alcohol. And it wasn't until I started to really look at myself on a deeper level and really inquire. Yeah, there was something that was just confusing as well, right. You know, because I had all of this white privilege that was like, you know, sitting there. And I was like, okay, so here I am coming from this, you know, what appeared to be an affluent family. And I was privately educated and I have a university degree in economics. And, you know, I was an entrepreneur. And then here I am 32 with this existential crisis. And the wheels have really come off. Like everything that I kind of valued is no longer of value. And yeah, as I think you've integrated, that's a really tough place to be. And in that sort of death, there is a rebirth that's available that isn't a construct, or wasn't a construct in my case, of wanting to be something or someone to please other people, to have success, to have wealth. It was really a kind of a really big fuck you moment. Yeah. It was a fuck you to everything that anyone had ever pinned on me for validation externally. And it was just coming home to myself of, okay, well, everyone else thinks these things are important, but what's actually important for me? Right. And that was tough because there hadn't been space for that in my childhood. It had been, this is what we do. This is culture. This is, you know, and it wasn't this spaciousness of an exploration of like, well, what do you like doing? So that's a really interesting place to sit in. Yeah. And then it was somewhat unique in as much as I mentioned, I was an entrepreneur. So I had some funds to work with in that time. So it was also like I didn't really have to work. I just basically burned my savings in this like weird state of self-inquiry, like seeking modalities and attempting to wean off alcohol. Yeah.
Hearing your journey, it reminded me of a conversation I had recently with your close friend Jord as well. And he had a very similar experience in the sense that, you know, he was this thriving CEO, thriving entrepreneur, and really, you know, from, I guess, the common metrics of society, successful.
Yes.
But then he had this breakdown moment, which required him to have a deep look into the identity from which he was coming from, and recognizing in that moment that it wasn't based on maybe his most authentic truth, but rather certain imprints that he may have received from his conditioning, experiences. And it sounds like you had a very similar moment in that way, that, you know, this breakdown moment allowed you to look into where was I coming from?
Yeah.
You know, how was I showing up? And was that really in alignment with what feels truthful for me, with what feels aligned to me?
100%. I think, you know, I love George very much. He's a dear friend, and I know his story well, and I can see there's an incredible amount of similarities in going into that space. And for him, I mean, it was also a life and death situation around a critical health incident, and so, you know, there's that it's kind of thinking about like real life begins when you realize you've only got one. And it was definitely that moment of being like, okay, like, am I going to choose this? And there was a sort of a willingness to lean in and be like, I'm going to choose life. And there was a much more of an empowering moment that came alive from that space of being like, instead of just kind of like drifting through this, I actually realized that I could die. And not only could I die, but I could also choose to end it. And somehow in touching and brushing into that level and depth of inquiry around suicide, I realized I was actually choosing life. And that was very empowering. And in doing that, I was like, well, if I'm choosing to live, I'm also choosing how I live.
Yeah.
Like, at least within my own self, right? At least within locus of control, what are the things I can choose? And so, yeah, it gave me an inquiry into, I think, motivation and then subsequent behavior, right? So what was driving me? Beyond like neurochemicals, beyond the dopamine, right? And even then, like, why was I self-validating, or was I self-validating? So I think, you know, when you touch into it, like, all of the external validation that I was receiving wasn't adding up to the internal validation that I wasn't giving myself, because I wasn't successful in my own eyes. And it wasn't that it was an imposter syndrome. I generally wasn't successful because the metrics that I wanted to live by, I wasn't living by. And things like, you know, deep connection to self, spaciousness and time, right relationship to the planet. Living in a healthy interdependent relationship versus codependency. Those were all like really important metrics to me. And I was scoring like 0 on all of them.
Right.
And so, yeah, society was scoring me at a 10 on how I might be appearing to show up. But really within my own self, I was bankrupt. And it was a harsh wake-up call. Like that essentially was the existential crisis. And I think, you know, early 30s is a great time to do that.
Absolutely, agreed. Yeah, no, I'm happy as well that I've really been going through that, you know, myself, you know, at this time frame, right? Yeah, so interesting. I mean, the first thing that I want to speak into is that this contemplation of death allowed you really to appreciate life more and actually be more deliberate in the way you want to live.
Yes.
Right? And the other contemplation that seems to have come alive was around this idea of relationship.
Yes.
And perhaps we can just as well expand on what you mean by that. And interesting enough, we as well had this conversation before we started around, and what I really love is how we have quite similar views on this topic, that, you know, relationship can be seen on a much broader spectrum than what we maybe are generally indoctrinated into. Could you speak a little bit more into what relationship means to you and what you ended up what did you start to unpack and to reveal for yourself around this topic of relationship?
Yeah, thank you. That word for me initially had a connotation around, you know, ultimately like a man and a woman and how they interacted, right? Which is like such a reductionist approach and so like laced with all sorts of like, you know, Northern European, North American, white, you know, classic kind of stuff, right?
I'm sure a lot of people can relate.
Yeah. And then I started to really get into that and be like, okay, well, but, you know, like what it actually is relationship. And I think some of the most valuable teachings that I've received have been from the native Canadian elders. I spent 4 years cultivating friendships with elders and sitting in sweat lodge ceremony and understanding a little bit more about their practices and the way that they wanted to live.
And that happened after this breakdown moment,
Yeah,
is that correct?
yeah. So that was kind of like in my mid-30s.
Right.
I was, through like some circumstance and like synchronicity, I was introduced to an elder called Vern Glenchanos, and I spent a lot of time connecting with Vern, a lot of the time just sitting with him, I wouldn't really say much, but it was just his presence was enough. And what Vern helped me to understand and see was that I was in a relationship to everything. And it was about how I was in relationship to water. And that was just like, if I just explore my relationship to water, even this morning, it's been incredible, right? I think about swimming, I think about a shower, I think about hydration, I think about urination. You know, I think about all of the ways I've been in relationship to water as an element. And so I started to deeply contemplate, explore, and observe myself and the relationships I had with elements. And then, from that, I started to explore more about like the relationship I had to movement or to breath. And there's also the relationship that I have to myself. And so, it's like relationship for me becomes this inquiry of like, how is energy and matter like exchanging, communicating, moving? So it's like, how is the unseen turning into the seen and then turning back into the unseen again? So it's kind of like an exploration of metaphysics through like putting myself in the witness or in the observer state. And I suppose it's more about using nature through observation as the teacher.
Yeah, I love hearing this. And, you know, it was just fascinating to hear how you spoke about, you know, your connection to water already just in this early morning that you've had. And considering, how much you've already been in relationship and connection with that aspect. And interestingly enough, this connection, this relationship is all around us.
Yeah.
It's there every single day.
Yeah.
But the question is how conscious, how present are we to that?
Yeah.
How much do we allow ourselves to really bring that into our awareness, and versus, I guess, taking it for granted.
Totally.
Is the word that comes up for me.
Yeah.
Right. And then the inquiry as well that arises from me as well, how does that as well influence our lives once we have that deeper understanding of our relationship to the elements, right? Our connection to the earth. And what did that look like for you?
Yeah, there's a deeper quality of responsibility that starts to emerge.
Interesting. That's not what I would have expected you to say.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah. So like, I know where my water came from this morning, right? So it's this understanding of how did it get here? How am I in relationship to it? If I take the same with food and I start to explore my relationship to food and I start to look at how it got to me, through that inquiry, I start to understand how everyone else has been in relationship to it. And what that requires me to do is to get radically honest about the impacts that I'm having on other people, right? And so one of the big problems for me was that I viewed myself in isolation. I viewed myself as this autonomous human doing life deeply disconnected. It was that disconnect that was doing a couple things. One is it was making me fucking miserable and ultimately probably quite depressed. And the other one is through that disconnection, I basically had a lack of love in a lot of different ways. So what came alive was this responsibility. And I take the relationship to my house, right? As you know, I live in a reclaimed wooden house that's solar powered, right? So this morning, like any power I used came from the sun. And so that responsibility ultimately is on me. And I think if we ignore our connections to things, we have an opportunity to kind of just deny. We can kind of just bypass the impact we're having on the planet, on other people, on everything. And so when we start to explore our relationships with conscious awareness, it starts to lead us to a path of greater self-responsibility. And responsibility is this beautiful thing because it allows us to have greater freedom, right? Because we can understand where our food and water is coming from. We understand how we're housing ourselves. We understand how we're breathing. We understand how we're in relationship to friends. And instead of blaming other things outside of ourselves for our life circumstance, through this journey of responsibility, we start to actually empower ourselves, but on a much deeper way that we know how we can get water, we know how we can get food, we know how we can survive. And what I learned from the natives is they could flourish in their environment because they observed it. And it's through that observation of how I'm in relationship to my environment that's brought a deep embodied sense of safety. And it's from that sense of safety that I can show up with greater freedom and connection or love.
Yeah. This is so much. I mean, there's so many things that I could get into, but I mean, first of all, this tension between responsibility and power. And the first thing that I like think of when I think of this idea of responsibility, and at least that was my impression in the past, has been that it feels burdening.
Yes.
It feels heavy.
Yes.
But I recognize the more I claimed a level of responsibility, the more empowered I felt. There was this interesting connection piece around what I claim responsibility over and the empowerment then that I feel as a result because of the choices that I now get to make because of the responsibility that I'm willing to take.
It is heavy. I think it's really fair, right? And what it's called is becoming an adult. Like that's really the path of growing up, right? And, you know, as we're talking about in like manhood or masculinity, it is stepping forward and up and saying like, I'm consciously making these choices.
Yeah.
What I came to realize is I'd been making those choices anyway.
Yeah.
I just hadn't been doing it consciously.
Right.
And I'd been kind of like pretending I wasn't or avoiding it. But when I actually stared it down, and I think staring down reality is one of the most effective things we can do to create more spaciousness and freedom and love in our lives. Yeah. So with that, there was a heaviness.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it can be really overwhelming. Like when we look at a meta problem and we see the enormity of what we're going to face, especially like in my own self, I was like, oh, I'm a fucking mess. I didn't, I had to just kind of take it bite size.
Right.
Yeah, and work on one piece at a time.
I love that realness, and I love as well just the, like truthful expression. It is heavy, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I've been contemplating over the last few months just this distinction between, what is the difference between a boy and a man, right? And I mean, I've heard different iterations of other people, and I guess as well in my own contemplations, what I have been exploring within myself is that in many ways on this journey of becoming a man and still being a boy, in many ways, it is this self-centric paradigm from which we come from. And that doesn't necessarily have to be negative, because in that way, like it's required, it's needed, right? It's like, that individual needs to be supported on that journey to become that, right?
Yes.
Whereas what I've been exploring around this idea of, becoming an adult, as you said, is this idea of having a connection, I'm going to say, to something bigger than ourselves.
Sure.
Right? And that's kind of like as well what we've been speaking into, this understanding of we're not just this autonomous, isolated being, but rather we're connected to everything to some degree. And that it does bring a level of responsibility to it, and a level as well of empowerment through, well, considering that I am in relationship to everything and everybody, how would I like to then be of service to that?
Yes. Yeah, there's a few pieces that come alive for me there, right? So the first one is this idea of self versus collective, right? And that's on a spectrum. On one end, we've got self-centric culture, which is probably the strongest in the United States. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got collective culture, which is present in most indigenous communities to a very high degree. And I think where we sit on that spectrum between collective and self, and our ability to pulse between those, is probably going to shape the way that we can relate effectively in the world. So if I'm only self-centric, I'm selfish, which is going to basically create a lot of tension in my interpersonal relationships, i.e. they're going to fail, right? And so ultimately, I'm not going to be able to meet my needs and wants very effectively. Right. If I'm only focused on collective, then it becomes shadowy, where I'm not going to honor myself. This is like the martyr. Right? And then I'm giving from a place of lack and not willing to receive. So what I came to recognize is, how do I actually honor those parts of me that are unique, that are uniquely me? How do I honor other people and their unique talents and gifts? And how does that all come together in such a way that I'm also part of a collective, right? And I can honor collective. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, part of what I really understood, if we take water as the example, is like, I love exploring the cycles of life with my son Onyx, right? And I tell stories about the water. And I like to say how here in Bali, it rains up on, Batu Karu, and then it flows all the way down through the Subat, and it turns into rice, and then the rice farmer harvests the rice and brings it to him, and he eats the rice, and then he poops, and then it goes down. And, so I talk about like how it everything flows, right? And I could do the same with air. And here we are sitting in this podcast studio. You and I are breathing the same air. And when I had that embodied recognition of that level of connection of every human on the planet, Vern, my teacher, would say, this smoke that we're burning right now, in 4 days will travel around the whole planet and everyone will breathe it. And that is your prayer. And it was like, okay, wow, that's an incredible piece of information. Now, I don't know if it's 4 days. It probably might be longer, 3 weeks. But on trade winds, that's going to happen, right? With water, it's the same. Like the water that's moving through me is going to move through you at some point. And what I loved was the recognition of the interconnectedness of all things and all beings. And that gave me this sense of awe and sense of wonder that there's something like quite incredible that's happening here that's beyond the isolated eye.
It sounds like, having been exposed to the indigenous tribes and as well being connected to your elder Vern has really allowed you to, I guess, take a step out of the culture that you were raised into and really allowed yourself to explore a much more, I'm going to say, holistic way of operating in the world and operating in life. One of the concepts or ideas that I've really been exploring has been this lack of elderhood within our culture and the absence of, I guess, deep wisdom that is passed on from, people who have really moved into a stage where they're sharing from their experiential learning. And so with that, we have an absence of really people who do not receive the guidance that's required in order to move into a new stage of evolution or maturity. I'm wondering, what influence did Vern have on you? You've kind of already been touching on it, but I'm wondering if you want to just
thank you,
communicate that.
I mean, I think the first thing was his presence. And his presence was just incredible. Just to sit and be with him in his presence, there was something that was magnetic and calming and spacious. And his words were just incredibly well chosen and landed. And he had this amazing ability with humor. For those listeners that have an understanding of Canadian history, like a real understanding of Canadian history, you'll know it's really dark, especially for the Indigenous people. And as someone that grew up in the UK, I moved to Canada as a visitor, and I have Canadian citizenship, and I'm extremely appreciative of that. And it comes with a sort of sense of guilt, a healthy guilt, I would say. And Vern, he called me a polar bear. He said I was white on the outside and red on the inside. And so it's kind of like...
Can you explain that?
Yeah, so it's like, I have white skin on the outside, but inside I'm red, and native Canadians, they say they have red skin. So he kind of said that, like, even though I appeared to be a white person, I was Indian in my heart in that sense. So we laughed about that, but Vern had this way with humor where he would say things that were like very edgy or inappropriate, like about white people and about like settlement or about like abuse, and he would say it with like a piercing stony face, and I would be like, fuck, and then he would just smile and laugh. Just kidding. And so he had this way of like taking things that were actually really, really tough and challenging and difficult and making lightness of them. And as you've experienced with the work that we do with breathwork and holding people in really deep emotional states, I think there's a balance between the ability to hold people in their deepest pain and then also kind of make lightness out of it, where like there is a requirement to lean into humor. And so I think what Vern, one of the things he really brought into my life was, kind of an ability to laugh at like the human experience. I think there was a lot of seriousness that was present in me in that experience in my early 30s, probably for good reason as well to a certain degree, but he allowed me to sort of sit in the heaviness but also be with the lightness. And I think that was really what Vern taught me, was the ability to be with paradox, and to be with like opposing tensions and hold them both.
And that is definitely the thing as well that came up for me, and something I really appreciate about you. Like you have this ability to, first of all, understand the extremes of the both ends of the tension and hold balance within like everything.
Yeah.
And there's so many different spectrums we can speak into where this tension exists. And you have an understanding of, okay, where are the extremes and where do I operate? Because one of the tendencies that can be present for so many of us is a binary approach, right? It's either this or that. And it's like we swing onto the one hand, and then all of a sudden this doesn't work for us, and then we go to the opposite spectrum. And that just doesn't work, right? And so having this ability to hold paradox is, in my opinion, a very strong, it's a strength.
Yeah, absolutely, bro. Like, you know, I can think about how I overworked, overachieved, sought a certain sense of recognition and success and all of those pieces. And then, I just, you know, really like forgot about all of that. And the pendulum swung the other way. And I went and lived in a stone cottage for 5 months with no contact. Like that was like an extreme isolation. And none of those behaviors were healthy, you know? So what I enjoy now is the middle way. And the middle way for me is the acknowledgement that I'm incredibly structured and I'm also super flowy and spacious. It depends where you look. I'm deadly serious and I sometimes can be quite funny. And so, you know, I'm very generous in certain ways, but I'm incredibly stingy in others. And I love looking at these parts of me that say, I'm super calm, but like, you know, put me in a Muay Thai ring and I'm going to fight. So I think the ability to embrace all of these facets of humanity, of our own humanness, and then witness it in another and accept it in another is really what I'm here for.
I mean, this is really such a gift, and really as well one of the topics that I want to speak into with you, this idea of being in a relationship to all parts of ourselves. And, you know, this is something that like very often comes as well in the breathwork sessions that we do, right?
Totally.
You know, people touch into certain aspects that they may have been taught, I can't go into this, or, you know, they've been taught to experience shame for those parts, but then as a result of that, they don't feel a sense of wholeness within, right? Because there's something, it can be just this like sensation, like something's missing or something is not quite right. You know? And speaking into this idea of like integrating all those aspects of ourselves.
There's parts that we can exile and cut off and not be in touch with because we're not safe to. And that's really wise. You know, this is, I think the first place is to approach it from that wisdom. Like in my childhood container, what did I need to do to receive love? Right? That's the first thing. We're looking for love and freedom, right? So what did I need to do to have a sense of love and have a sense of freedom? And as I started to unpack that, I realized there were a bunch of behaviors there that I had, you know, practiced, cultivated that were, pretty fucking toxic, honestly. And I had to really like take a really good deep look at them. One of the biggest ones was people pleasing, right? And it was the inability to actually sit with someone else in their discomfort, or for someone else to be, one of the biggest ones was really disappointment. I was really challenged to sit in someone else's disappointment, especially women.
Of yourself.
Like if a romantic,
somebody.
Disappointing someone else, especially romantic partners. And like, you know, that disappointment of unrealistic expectation that a romantic partner might have on me, that I would then, I would start doing backflips, or like, you know, I would start doing anything to avoid their sadness and disappointment when it's their own unreasonable expectation that I really just wanted them to sit in. So I think, you know, that's been very, very interesting to explore. And we have this opportunity in all relationships to explore ourselves and be like, okay, like, what are the parts of me that I don't want to face? What are the emotions I don't want to feel? And you touched into it around shame. It's like, for a lot of men, there's a shame and vulnerability in general expression of emotion, right? So like, this is where, you know, a lot of men are blamed for being, a lot of men are labeled as emotionally unavailable. A lot of men are blamed as being emotionally unavailable. And both of those things could probably be quite true. And the deeper question for me is why? Like, why are men not willing to feel into their heart and express themselves? And normally it's because they have been shamed in the past.
That's it.
And or that expression is weaponized against them later in the future. So I start to sort of explore, how safe am I to be me? And what I've come to realize is it's very variable. So normally our conversations don't happen in a podcast room. They happen like at ammo, like in a sauna, or they happen, you know, over a cup of tea. And I feel very safe in my expression to you. And now I'm noticing that I can still feel quite safe in expressing in conversation with you, even though we're recording it. Thankfully, this isn't live and there's no one sitting with us. So it kind of keeps it like you and me chatting and hanging out, right? So I think I've been interested to explore not just like, this is me and I'm going to just be authentic. It's like, look, there's a sliding scale of my authenticity, and I'm going to have really a decent level of discernment around when I share what. And I'm now better at assessing how safe I am to share those parts of me at different times.
Yeah. And speaking into that, it seems like it can as well be quite healthy at certain times to, maybe want to, I'm going to say, like, withhold certain expressions of us, even though they may be most truthful for us because we don't feel safe within that moment.
Yes, and also that expression might impact other people.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some things I've done that I'm deeply ashamed of, right? And I'm not going to speak to them.
Sure.
And that's because I'm ashamed of them because of the impact they have basically on myself, and potentially on other people who have, I've impacted. That's that quality of discernment that I think sometimes people forget in the search of authenticity, right? And so this idea that I'm just sharing my truth is incredibly damaging if we're not contemplating the impact that that's going to have on other people. Yeah.
Right. It kind of comes back to this topic of relationship, right? How is what I'm doing, how is what I'm saying, how I'm being influencing another person and impacting them?
Yeah. And so that was like the deeper question is like, how does my existence like impact life? Right.
Which is an interesting question that probably not many people ask themselves.
Right.
Actually.
And that was what I was sitting there and I was like, wow, like, what am I bringing anything here, or am I just taking? Right. And so what I kind of settled upon is, this human experience isn't for me to just take. This human experience is for me to create and to co-create. And when I recognized this was a co-creative process where I was in collaboration with humans and life force energy, things really started to shift, in a way that I couldn't kind of have imagined. And so I think it was the embracing of that tension between self and community. And it was like, okay, so I'm here for me. Yeah. Let's get real on that one. And I'm also here for humanity. And how do those both coexist? And that is a question I continue to ask myself I think really in a deep way every quarter, like every kind of like, quarter of the year, I kind of sit down and I'm like, okay, now what? And that's, I think, where there's been evolution in what I do in terms of the way I show up in service and work. Like, as you know, the organization's evolving rapidly in terms of business. And that's coming from a place of the willingness for these stages and chapters to close and these parts of me to die for something else to be born.
I'm wondering where that value of giving back kind of came from for you, considering, or this contemplation of, where am I just attempting to take versus actually trying to give. And really understanding as well this connection between self and community. It's
interesting because we get into this kind of like very philosophical discussion. My grandfather, he taught me this question, and he asked me, "Is any act of giving ever selfless?" Right? And it's this idea that when I give, I'm always going to receive somehow. Right? So every act of giving has a certain quality of selfishness. And I've really been contemplating that. And I suppose when this is the beauty of compromise in romantic relationship. When I give someone something and it hurts me, not harms me, but hurts me, i.e. like it comes at a cost. And that cost could be my energy, it could be my focus, it could be monetary. But if I give from that place without desiring anything back in return, I still feel good. I still get the benefit of feeling good about it. One of the Lakota traditions is to give away things that really are meaningful. Yeah. And you've seen me do that a lot.
Absolutely.
I give away like drums and drumsticks and things that I really care about. Sure. And it hurts. It genuinely hurts me to do that. And in that moment of pain of giving something that's of value to me, the other person receiving it, whether they value it or not, doesn't matter. But I get value out of giving. And I think it's one of the greatest paradoxes of humanity. I think a lot of people are yet to really embody and understand that as a teaching. When we give from a place where it's like genuinely offering something, and there's a bit of tension or discomfort in doing it, we still receive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you describe what it is that you receive from your experience?
Well, I think there's a letting go, firstly, right? So there's a loss.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's a great practice in
yes.
itself.
Yeah, exactly, bro. And that's where it's like, I in the last 8 years, I've lost everything that I've owned multiple times, like through stupid behavior, right? Lack of awareness, and also on times just generosity. It was more like, it was just, a lot of it was experimental. I don't have a desire to do that again. Just to really speak that one really clearly as a prayer. I'm pretty happy now with ownership of certain things. So, yeah, I guess giving, the pain of giving, yeah, there's something that I receive in that loss. There's something where it's like, there's a value. And I think there's a freedom that comes in that, where it's like, you know, that Lakota tradition is the influential individuals in the community would gift everything to those in need, and then would just recreate, and then we just do it again. And what it comes down to is a belief in myself, in my relationship to humanity and the planet, that even if I lose everything, I can still get it all back. And that's like a really deep embodied confidence. And that's not about manifestation or abundance. It's just actually being in power.
Right. So there's two things that come up for me. First of all, this trust that we're kind of held by something bigger.
Yes.
And then the second thing is kind of having this self-belief and this understanding of one's own power, that even if we do lose everything, we can just recreate it.
Yes. There's two things I think. Yeah. One is this value. Like, I know I bring value, and I bring value not because of what I do, but because of what I can see, like what I witness, like just my ability to observe the movement of energy in and of itself is value. When I look at like consultants in business, they go in and the first thing they do is just they watch everything, right? And in just sitting in a space, you want to know how a company works really well, go and sit in it and watch, you know, how they get their paper clips, who brings them lunch. Like, just in watching those things, you start to understand a lot about an organization. And so what I came to realize is there's value just in being the witness, and people would even pay you for that. And so, as you know, I get paid quite well to observe people breathing. And what I've done is I've spent over 10,000 hours watching humans breathe. And every time I do that, I get technically better at it. I get better at reading the subtleties and minutiae of a human. And there's value in that. So what I came to realize is there's value in being and value in observing and witnessing. And that kind of uncoupled the Western capitalist belief that there's value in doing.
That's it.
And so now I'm creating from this space of the value of being, and from that place going into right action, aligned action, and doing. Yeah. And as a continued cycle of being, doing, masculine and feminine, pulsing between those, I get to create like incredible, experiences and shared opportunities and
Yeah. I mean, this is just so incredibly valuable in the sense that I just connect with so many men that I speak to, and like one of the things that I continuously see is that their sense of self-worth, their sense of value comes much more from what it is that they're doing versus an understanding of who they're actually being within that process. And usually it kind of it keeps them in these very staggering ups and downs, you know, where at times they may receive validation or appreciation for the things that they do, but then as soon as that's not present, their sense of self-worth plummets in so many ways. And I mean, I in many ways have been as well exploring, you know, what is a more balanced approach around this idea of self-worth that is not defined on simply what I do in the world, and at the same time I love to do. I love to contribute to some degree, so like there's a joy and pleasure that I find in that. But I think like getting caught up with our sense of self-value within that is definitely a path, I guess, that can bring us down destruction. Yeah.
Thank you, bro. Definitely. I think it's just an interesting one for us to continue to navigate. When our doing is validated with a financial exchange, and then how we can continue to get rewarded from that.
Yeah. So perhaps we can kind of segue now and start speaking just a little bit into the breath. And I want to speak a little bit more about, this relationship that you continuously see between the way people breathe or the way people show up, and then how that as well translates over to the way people are breathing.
Yeah. Thank you, bro. I started on this journey, over a decade ago now, and it started through movement. And I started to explore how I was moving. And what I realized is so much of my movement patterns were habituated and subconscious. And I started to excavate those. I started to make my movement a little bit more potent and a little bit more aware and a little bit more conscious. And that led me down a path to, explore deeply yoga asana and then free movement and qigong. And those are all vehicles or practices for bringing presence and awareness to our movement. So it was like I started down this path of embodiment. And after a couple of years, I discovered connected breathing. And connected breathing was taking away all physical movement of muscles and only using the muscles of breathing as the vehicle of embodiment. So I was just observing just the diaphragm, the intercostals, maybe pelvic floor and throat. And then I brought one-pointed focus into my internal landscape, and I realized I didn't know how to breathe, and I had no awareness or control over my breath mechanics. To the point where when I brought awareness to them, I went into a totally altered state of awareness and had zero control over my being, which was terrifying and somewhat like liberating at the same time.
I can definitely relate.
I was like, to speak openly about your journey as well, if I may.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, you came into the connected breath space in a very good space of movement, embodiment, yoga, awareness, right?
Yeah.
And then you step in and look, it's really humbling because suddenly there's this technique that's really sharp and really clear and really focused. And it's like, hey, these are all of the places that you're still not aware of or embodied, like in yourself and in breath. And it was like, for me, it was like, oh, wow. Like I'm an absolute novice at this. I'm a novice at breathing. And for me, it was like 33 years old. I don't know how to breathe. And so, over time, I've gotten quite proficient at observing and understanding breath mechanics and creating the ability for my body to choose the breathing rhythm that's appropriate. So the ability for my subconscious mind, my body, to just pick the breath rhythm that's appropriate for the situation.
What do you mean by that? Can you elaborate on that a little bit? And why would that be valuable?
Thank you, bro. So basically, if our inhale's activating and our exhale's relaxing, that's like a reductionist approach,
Sure.
Which the listeners might value. As I inhale, I'm going to bring in more oxygen, more life force energy. As I exhale, I'm going to release CO2 and relax. So it's very reductionist and basic. There's a lot more going on. But if we just operate from that premise, if I can breathe with different speeds, shapes, and stability of breath, that's going to change the way that my nervous system is functioning and my endocrine system, my glands, which are influencing blood chemistry. So basically, breathing is a direct gateway into changing level of activation or relaxation, both in a breath element, our blood pH, and also our endocrine system, our blood chemistry. So I can change the quality of my being, of my feeling, by changing my breath rhythm consciously. So great. If I go through the conscious practice of changing all my breathing rhythms, that's fantastic. But I don't want to do that all day. Like I'm breathing 23 to 26,000 times a day. If I attempt to control my breath for 23 to 26,000 times a day, I can't speak. I can't have conversations. I can't think. I can't interact with my son. There's a lot of things I can't do. So what's incredible about our subconscious is we buffer things into the subconscious so that we don't have to remember them. How to walk, how to back out of our driveway. These are all things that we know, right? And you can go back to a house 4 years ago that you were living at and you'll know how to back out the driveway without thinking about it. So that's the power of the subconscious. Now, we buffer things like breath into our subconscious, and unfortunately, our subconscious sometimes doesn't do it very well. For a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's trying to protect us, and sometimes we've had a surgery or something that's influenced breath. So there's a lot of different reasons our breath might not be functioning correctly. So what we would love to see as a human is that we've got a full, dynamic, breath rhythm that's available, from small, shallow to fast, voluminous, and everything in between. And that we can breathe all the way into the pelvic floor and all the way into the top of the lung.
Yeah, having an understanding of this and learning how to breathe more dynamically as well in my own life was really a game changer. And I remember, like when I started on this journey and when I met you, one of the things that was really present for me on a continuous basis was anxiety.
Yeah.
I was constantly dealing with anxiety and this constant stress and pressure. And I didn't know how to balance that out with a level of relaxation within my life. And so I really had to cultivate, I guess, a bigger range, a bigger ability to fluidly move into deeper states of relaxation. And I recognize now that at times, that can still be present, but it's not something that I experience chronically anymore.
Yeah,
and even if it does arise, it is something that I know how to be with a level of confidence that wasn't present before. And I guess just me sharing this, I want to just speak as well into the potency of this technique and how it literally changed my life.
Yeah, thank you, bro. So. Yeah, I mean, me as well. It changed my life to the point where it's like, wow, there's life before breathwork and there's life after. And yeah, I've loved witnessing your journey. It's been incredible. And there were so many great qualities and attributes you'd already learned and already embodied by the time you showed up in the space to practice connected breathing. We kind of touched on it, and stress isn't the problem, right? It's chronic habituated stress that's the problem. And it's the inability to relax and integrate that stress that's the problem. Stress in and of itself is actually very healthy. I like to stress myself consistently, and I like to relax. And so, if we're using survival energy, and if we're using rhythms of breath that are meant for escape or that are meant for very small bursts, and we're using that throughout an extended period of time, the system is going to have a deep imbalance. And what is going to be required is for it to rebalance. And that's typically overachievement into burnout, which we see in a lot of leaders, CEOs, execs, founders. And what I've come to realize is if I wanted to build this organization to the depth and scale that I envision in the world, I needed to relax. And I needed to take time for me, and I needed to take time out. And that's a continued practice.
Yeah, and we kind of as well spoke into it that, there's usually a reason why we stay in these default ways of being, these habituated ways of being. And one of the explorations, specifically in this modality that we're trained in, is to explore very often as well the opposite side of the spectrum and the things that people are shadowing, often for many reasons that we've as well already spoken into. But perhaps you can speak a little bit more around that journey of touching into those aspects that we may have not felt safe to get into, or we were, told continuously that it's not okay for us to go there. What's the value of doing that, and how does it as well impact the way we show up in our lives once we do find the courage to actually go into those aspects and build a relationship to them? Yeah,
thank you, bro. Well, I think something more tangible, I could take money, right? And which I think, as most listeners will have a relationship to money, and money is a store of value. It gives us the ability to purchase things and to meet our needs. And as I grew up, there was a paradox in my household where there was actually a fairly decent amount of money, but there was consistently never enough in the mindset, in the narrative, in what was being spoken to. And money was an excuse for my needs to not be met. We didn't have the money, whereas it was just more a question of prioritizing. And so what that led me to have was a very confused relationship to money. And money was evil on the one hand, but we needed it on the other. And so, it took me quite a while to integrate that. And so what it led me to do was to basically work so hard that I almost went bankrupt. So it comes back to this pendulum, right? That we kind of already touched into around behavior. The thing I was avoiding so much was bankruptcy, or was loss, or was net zero, or debt, even worse, right? And in avoiding it so much, I was striving for success to such a degree that the only possible outcome was failure.
Why is that the only outcome in those moments when we're so attached to, I guess, the success?
Because working that hard is only going to lead to burnout, right? It's just an inevitable. And clinging and gripping so much to something is going to mean that I'm not going to achieve it, right? There's that, when I look at people, and again, what it depends on is how we define success, right? But ultimately, financially, if I define success as meeting my basic needs, financially meeting my basic needs, having enough left over to save for my future, and creating some wealth such that when I'm retiring, my needs are met. Like, that's how I would define financial success, right? And that's actually quite a long-term game. And it's I didn't know how to do that. My parents didn't know how to do that. They still don't. And they're figuring that out. But there's a formula for that. And it isn't about getting it done in the next year. It's about slow, steady steps over time. So for true financial freedom, most great investors, they're looking at the long game. Yeah. And so short-term bursts of energy to create any sort of legacy is not going to work. That's ultimately like why I failed multiple times. Yeah.
So yeah, I really feel like you're touching into, I guess, the what's the word I'm looking for? The futility within staying caught in one pattern, right? And finding, as we've been speaking about within the entire podcast so far, finding the middle way.
Yeah, the middle way.
Finding a more balanced approach. We haven't really touched on it, and I think this would be really interesting for the listeners. How do they start finding, getting on this journey of finding the middle way? It seems like that is definitely a big path that you've been on. So what would that look like for our listeners to really get started on that journey? Yeah,
thank you, bro. Well, as soon as you speak into that, the first thing that comes to mind is I don't really know. And then after that, when I actually sit and contemplate a bit more, I'm like, well, the answer's right there. I don't. And where it actually comes from for me is a deeper sense of feeling.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we do with our clients is we unpack the feeling state, right? And it's tricky. And there's a lot of terrible self-help advice around do what feels right? Look, sitting on the couch and eating ice cream feels right. But if I keep doing that, in about 2 weeks, it's not going to feel right anymore, right? So I think really the middle way comes back to this acknowledgement of moderation, but also how is my feeling body guiding me? Now, one of the problems that we've touched into on this is oftentimes our emotional states, they get a bit cross-wired. So vulnerability gets crossed with shame, right? Which it ought not to. It ought to be crossed with courage and love and compassion, right? As an example. But if we've been shamed for vulnerability as opposed to celebrated for it with honoring the courage it takes to be vulnerable and then a compassionate receptivity, we're not going to do it anymore. So I think, part of the problem that we face as humans is, just do what feels right is terrible because most people's feeling compass is fucked, right? So the real depth of the work is to come back to our feeling compass and acknowledge, why is it I feel guilty for taking a day off, right? This is a total miswire in me that I had to navigate. I felt guilt for rest. I was guilted all the time when I was a child for not doing enough, for not being good enough, not getting good enough grades, all of these pieces. Guilt's really powerful. I don't want to feel it. It sucks. And so in that wiring, I consistently avoided my own guilt of rest, which led to burnout over and over again. So the answer for me to find the middle way is to start to explore, what am I feeling? And then the next question is, why? And that's the deeper piece. Because if I'm in a romantic relationship and it doesn't feel very good because my partner's holding me accountable and I quit because it doesn't feel good, that's denial and avoidance, which is bullshit, right?
Yeah.
But if my partner's holding me accountable and it's making me have guilt because I'm not in integrity with my words and my agreements, good, lean into that, right? So I think what we need to get really clear on, why is the guilt coming up? And am I avoiding it because it doesn't feel good because I want to continue to have a lack of responsibility in my life? Or is it actually because there's a path forward here for me to be in greater integrity and accountability with myself and with other humans around me?
Man, there's so much here. Yeah,
Can of worms.
Yeah. And I want to just like reflect
Yeah.
a few things back. I guess we spoke as well into how guilt and shame can come in, and they're cross-wired with certain aspects of us that are actually quite natural.
Yeah.
And as a result, it impacts the way we operate in the world,
Yes.
which is actually, of course, a very needed sensation to have,
Yes.
to operate in society, but in denying ultimately certain aspects of us that are quite natural. I mean, you spoke into, the expression of emotional unavailability for men.
Yes.
Like if that is being shamed and guilted, like they're ultimately forced into that pattern.
Yeah, even deeper.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, I mean, shaming anyone, male or female, for emotional unavailability is a categorically and I will say it as a definitive, worst thing we can do. Right? If someone's emotionally unavailable and you label it and then shame them for it, guess what? Like we got into a meta spiral of being ashamed about our emotions. This is really tricky.
Yeah.
And it's coming alive pretty ferociously right now in our culture and society. It's coming alive to be seen.
Yeah.
And as men or as emotionally unavailable women out there, it's our responsibility to connect more deeply to ourselves.
Yeah.
Culturally, collectively, it's all of our responsibilities to acknowledge that compassion's the way forward here. Shame isn't.
Yeah. And speaking into as well, like the path forwards for many, it sounds like permission. First of all, the permission of our feeling state is, first of all, the first step.
Yeah.
And then as well, having this inquiry around the feeling state. So why am I feeling the way I'm feeling?
Yeah.
And as well, having an understanding of, well, I guess the one thing as well that I got out of what you said was that at times discomfort is needed. And there's value in sitting in the discomfort when you were sharing about, a partner perhaps as well holding us accountable to something.
Yes.
That is actually incredibly needed. And where that can get challenging is where we're in a continuous pursuit for something that may be gratifying, or as you said, something that feels good.
Yeah,
Right?
sure. Like it's tricky, right? Because we don't also want to feel all the feelings all the time. And I think emotionality is on a spectrum, right? So people are either not very emotional or they are very emotional. Neuroticism in the big five is kind of how it's labeled, right? And then on the other spectrum that I like to put as a balancing metric is awareness. So people are not very emotional, not very aware, all the way through to very emotional and very aware. The worst combination of that is very emotional and not very aware, which is really tricky, which shows up in a lot of personality disorder. And so if we take that kind of spectrum of, ability to track our own emotions and what the volatility of the response is, that starts to create a level of awareness that brings a lot more liberation. With that as well, I think there's also this kind of like thing that we need to realize is like sometimes I wake up and I feel shit and I can spend like 20 minutes trying to figure out why. Guess what? It's because I'm human, right? And so also we can like go into like the logic and reasoning or the desire to know, and there just needs to be surrender. So if I have ironed out like top 4, which I put as breath, sleep, movement, and nutrition, if I'm fairly standard in those, then most of the time I'm going to feel pretty good, right? Depending on what else is going on in my life. And I think it's just important to not dive in too deeply to find the meaning about the feeling all the time. So again, it's the middle way. It's like, I don't really want my level of awareness to be internal as well. So we've got this really complex and nuanced thing that we're approaching around using emotions as a compass to guide us. And with that, honoring that, the presence of fear, guilt, and shame, they're very, very powerful emotions. We want to avoid them. They're also very healthy at times. I want to be scared of venomous snakes. I want to be scared of having a bike accident. I don't want it to stop me, going for a walk or riding my scooter. So again, it's these moderations of like, when is this emotional response appropriate? And I think that's really what I started to question is like, what's the appropriateness of my emotional response right now? I'm coming in at an 8. And I'd be like, what would be like a reasonable emotional response? I'd be like a 3. I was like, okay, well, so 5 of these emotions, right, that I'm feeling, the intensity of 5 is not relevant. So why am I having that response? There's something here for me to look at from conditioning in probably my childhood or a wound.
What do you do in those moments? Like, if
Sit
you
with it.
Sit with it.
That's the first thing. And not change it.
Yeah.
And not have a desire to change it.
Why is that important?
Because otherwise I think I'm avoiding or bypassing. Ultimately, it's a lack of acceptance of myself. Right. So then I'm getting into this like, yeah, I mean, you know, you and I have experienced this a lot with some of these more potent practices, breath of fire, or some of the tantric practices of express and release. I'm using my mind to change my internal state as opposed to just noticing what's there. And if I get into a habit of doing that, I think it can be even more damaging. I'm angry. Oh, great. I'll go and beat the punching bag. Great. I mean, that's a good expression of anger. I'll go and pillow beat. Great. That's a great expression of anger. But what if I sit in the anger and I watch it and I'm actually really with it? And I think what this comes back to is I wasn't taught to do that. Yeah. Why? Well, because my parents weren't very good at sitting in their anger. So they suppressed and exploded as opposed to the middle way. So with Onyx, you know, with my son, I'm really content to say that his mother and I have both been really willing to sit with him in his emotional responses. And yeah, I mean, time will tell, but his compass seems to be fairly attuned. And of course, I'm also saving money for his therapy, which every good parent ought to be doing, because we're going to make mistakes because we're human. And my ability to own that and to apologize and to be willing to sit with him and pay for therapy for him and myself, I think is my responsibility as a parent.
Yeah, again, there's so much here, everything that you're sharing, and so much gold. I guess I definitely want to speak into, you know, fatherhood, and I kind of just going to keep a side note, you know, for a bit later. But the thing that I'm hearing from what you said was we don't always want to explore a prescriptive approach for dealing with something, but we have to have a level of inquiry around what is the moment asking of me, what is like needed in that moment. So when you say that, you know, maybe what you're experiencing is an 8, but what's actually appropriate is a 3, you know, to actually and actually asking yourself the question, well, what do I need in this moment in order to really I guess come to a sense of center again, right?
Yeah, we're very predictive as humans. We need it, right? We want to basically plot. I think one of the reasons that we've had evolution in the way that we have as humans is because we're able to pattern recognize and predict the future to a terrible degree. Like, we're really bad at it. Like, that's the reality, right? And we think we're good at it. And this is cognitive bias. And this is where data over feelings is actually very effective. When we start to plot ourselves and look at our own data and look at our own patterns of behavior, we can get really clear on what is and isn't working for us. And so as we're predictive, oftentimes we take experiences from our past and we layer them into the now. And we say, well, this happened before, and so I'm going to predict that this will happen again. Now, that's dangerous because the world is very dynamic. Exactly. And so we've taken a very reductionist approach to attempt to make things safe and easy in our mind. Simple example would be like sitting here in this podcast studio and imagining the conversation would be the same as previously I've sat in this podcast studio. It's not. It's never going to be, right?
Absolutely not.
But the same is with breath. If I approach breath as a breathwork practitioner with the belief that this client is going to breathe in any way the same as the previous client, I'm giving them a total disservice. Yep. What we train as breathwork practitioners is the ability to be with what is moment to moment, breath to breath. You've never taken the same breath twice. Yep. I've never guided you on anywhere near the same journey. You've categorically always had very different expressions. 100%. There might be some qualities that I can see that are thematic, that are consistent. But for the most part, your expression is going to be unique. And I think there's value in us as beings to kind of approach each new day and be like, okay, well, what's going to happen today? Yeah. Just because I'm doing things that are similar, like, it's going to be different. And if we haven't had a lot of safety and security in our childhood, it's likely we would attempt to control and have a lot of safety and security as adults. What I'm interested in is leaning into new experiences. We need both. We need consistency, safety and security, and we need these new experiences. So, yeah, I like to kind of explore that.
Yeah, it allows us as well just to be more in the moment and actually be more connected to the aliveness of each moment, you know, versus having what happened in the past, you know, or like, you know, having been in the, let's say in a podcast studio yesterday, and then like imagining or imposing that, you know, exactly this is what's going to be happening today. So I believe there's a flavor here that really allows us to be more connected to the aliveness and as well the dynamism that is continuously present within our experience.
And I think that's a practice, right? And this is why I love being a breathwork practitioner and having spent this amount of time. You sit there and you watch and you go, I don't know.
Yeah.
And that moment is when you start to be in service of the client, right? Because you say, I don't know. And it's this willingness to admit that we don't know, which I think is incredibly humbling. Yeah. And I think that's the place that we start to approach life from, with newness and with openness, moment to moment. And I can speak about it in romantic relationships as well. It's like, just because I've had X, Y, or Z in a romantic relationship doesn't mean it's going to be here in the next one. But if I believe it is, I'm probably going to approach it from that same space and recreate the same thing again.
Yeah, or we have been noticing, let's say, in a partner, a certain pattern, and we are continuously imagining that they're going to be like showing up a certain way.
Yes.
You know, it doesn't really allow them as well to show up in a new way.
No.
If we're constantly as well already preparing ourselves that they're going to show up this way.
There's managed expectations in there, right? And this is where, like, you know, some of the deeper father-mother wounds start to play out in a romantic relationship, because we're projecting a way or a pattern of behavior that we've witnessed, you know, and we're bringing it forward again. When we go through these experiences of collapse, we wipe the slate clean and we come back to a version of ourselves that can be like very, very new. And we allow ourselves to basically no longer operate with those previous predictive mechanisms that kept us safe in our childhood. Yeah. And now we're like, okay, what's here? Yeah. How does this human relate to me?
Yeah, this touches really back into kind of how we started this whole conversation around this idea of breakdowns and as well being humbled by our experiences. You've already been touching a little bit into, we've been speaking about relationship on a broader spectrum.
Sure.
But I would love to hear as well, how is that connected to engaging with other people? And we've spoken to a few things, how we may want to modulate, like we're conditioned into modulating people's behavior through guilt and shame. You already described how it's like the worst thing that we can do.
Yeah, sure.
And we are as well like constantly perhaps stuck in what has happened before with maybe an ex-partner. So I kind of want to as well move into this conversation of, well, how do we navigate that in intimate relating with other people? I guess the first thing I want to speak into, if you notice, like in those moments when we are maybe entrained to meet a pattern with shame and guilt for our partners, what do you believe would be a more appropriate path forwards?
Yeah, thank you, bro. I think, you know, shame, guilt, and fear are really, they're the emotions that are the cornerstones or the foundation for manipulation, right? And so if someone is wielding or leveraging fear, guilt, or shame against us, they are being manipulative.
Yeah,
right?
They're being directed into a certain way of being.
Yes. And the first thing I think is to honor innocence, right? So it's just like, hey, like this person thinks that this is the way to get needs met. And so outside of that, I think really the first thing is inquiry and choice, but also speaking into what our want or our need is first, without in any way attempting to influence the outcome of the other person. So I think this is what's like kind of important.
I think that's where a lot of people get stuck, right?
Yeah. And there's also this subtle difference between influence and control. But ultimately, when I operate from like game theory, the idea of 1 + 1 equals 5, right? That's where I would like to approach relationship from. And what this means is in relationship, romantically or otherwise, when I go to meet my need and I cooperate with someone else, I want their need to also be met. I don't want it to be a cost to them, right? And so, yeah, I think I like to operate now with this idea of win-win-win. How can everyone win? And that's, I think that's in terms of game theory, I think it's possible.
Yeah. What it really touches on for me is just this, deep honoring of the other person versus finding, like this way of attempting solely to get our needs met at the expense of another.
This is the key, right? So am I meeting my needs with them or am I meeting my needs through them? And as soon as we start to meet our needs through someone else, it's codependency and manipulation. And it's only going to be a one-way street to misery. And what it requires is us to get radically honest around ourselves and around how we're an autonomous human and we're very capable of meeting our own wants and needs, firstly. So we need to be self-reliant to a high degree. And with that, we need to acknowledge there are a whole bunch of needs that we're not going to meet on our own.
Yeah.
Like I've done a lot of time alone in solitude, in isolation as well.
Yeah.
And what I came to realize is it's not very enjoyable. And so, you know, those other qualities of connection and joy and love and pleasure that I am seeking in a reasonable, balanced way with responsibility, I want those to be met. And I want to speak to them without the associated Christian shame as an example around sexual expression. Or like wealth and abundance as well could be present. There could be some shame around that as well. So I think the key here is how do we meet our needs together? And that is now we start getting into a deeper quality of relating.
Yeah, I love that, you know, and for me, the word, you know, that comes up is interdependence.
Yes.
Right? And it as well comes in the spectrum of independence and codependence.
Yeah.
Right? And for us to come together in a way where we, sure, you know, to a certain extent, we can meet our own needs, but then as well, we understand the limitation of what it is that we can maybe do on our own. We tap into the part of us that, like that, to a certain degree, that can be quite tender. And there is a recognition, to a certain degree, I do need this person.
Yeah.
Right? And we come together in this way.
Yeah. I think, you know, it's really interesting to assess needs versus wants, right? Because if you come back to...
Can you tell me the difference?
Yeah, sure. So like a need is a requirement for me to thrive in terms of my physical, mental, and emotional. Like, let's just start there, right?
Sure.
So physically, mentally, emotionally, I have needs. Water, food, and some quality of connection is actually like acknowledged as being a human need. Now, having done time in isolation, like in terms of like 5 months living in a stone cottage with very little human contact, no phone, no internet, no electricity, like I realized that I'm actually pretty okay on my own. It wasn't very fun, but it was possible. So that helped me to acknowledge that a level of neediness kind of dropped out of me because I was able to self-resource. Yeah. And then, so needs, I think it's very sticky to label desires as needs and then ask our partner to meet them.
Why is that? Why do you believe that's challenging?
Well, because I think a lot of people use desire to meet, to emotionally regulate. So I'll just speak right into it. Like sex is an obvious one. Sex is not a need. It's a want. Like, and we just have to get clear about that. You can just research it anywhere. And it's a fairly common piece and understanding around humanity, right? Nurturance is very likely to be on the edge of need want. Like humans need a certain sense of nurturance, right? But that can show up in physical contact, or it could show up in just someone holding some space as well. It doesn't even need to be physical. So I think it's interesting to explore this idea for physical connection and whether it's a need or a want. And so, look, I mean, I opened the can of worms, and like sex is one of them, right? And you know, for men and women, this is an interesting exploration. It's a very powerful energy. It feels really good. We want to probably engage in it, and it can get really easily weaponized in relationships.
Yeah. Do you believe there's a certain spectrum and as well a subjective, I guess, understanding around needs and wants? You know, like maybe that for one person, certain thing may not be a need, but then for another, like, is there a sense of subjectivity, I guess, connected to that, or is it really more, would you say, biological?
I think it's subjective biological. Yeah,
Okay.
I think we can define it really clearly.
Right.
Yeah, and I think if we do that and we all get clear about it, it kind of pulls away like this idea that I need you to meet my need. It's like you don't.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's important to get there as well. In romantic relationship, it allows for really good and managed expectations.
Yeah.
I am capable of holding myself. And sometimes it's nice to have someone hold me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm capable of holding myself, and sometimes I need support from someone else.
Yeah.
Right. And in admitting that, there's a vulnerability. How I choose to get that need met is up to me. I can do it through a clear request or through financial exchange, in terms, not talking about sex here, by the way, talking about like therapy as an example, right? So like I've got great friends and I've got a really great team. And if I need support, I'm going to reach out. And if that isn't available, I've got people I can pay to emotionally support me,
100%.
right? If my partner's not available to emotional support me and they've made that clear, I'm not going to shame them into that. I'm going to honor them and say, you don't have capacity right now. Great, I totally get it. I'm fully resourced. And the problem is if I'm not fully resourced, I might use a manipulative tactic to get my need met.
how can we live from a deeper place of honoring where another person may be at, and at the same time honor ourselves in the process?
I think it's this ability to recognize that my need is not more important than theirs.
I think this is this is so important. I mean, I just see, like, I mean, I just think of past experiences in relationship, you know, where there was this imposition of, okay, no, like my needs are more important than yours in this moment.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because, I mean, based on my makeup of my conditioning, I bought into it so many damn times.
Sure, bro. You're a good spiritual man. You're showing up and you're like, yeah, I'll do anything I can to meet your needs.
Yeah.
I'm here for you. Yeah. And that's that overgiver quality that shows up, right? And I relate to that so fully and deeply. What I've really been celebrating more recently is acknowledging where my boundaries are and being like, hey, look, I'm very capable of showing up fully in romantic relationship. And this is where the line is drawn. And yeah, there's a frustration that comes alive in me when people attempt to use a variety of different tactics to cross that boundary and not honor me. Yeah. And I won't engage in a romantic relationship with people that do that.
Yeah, and I guess what's as well really required in that moment is to have that ability to, as you said, like be willing to have another person be disappointed in us.
Yes.
And as well have this ability to speak to a boundary actually and stay firm, stay steady.
Totally, bro. Right? Look, what I'm really practicing and learning more and more in a lot of areas, romantic for sure, but also in business, is this compassionate no, right? And so initially I can put a boundary up and it's great. Yeah. There it is. Everyone hears it. We're good, right? And then, if it's pushed against, the first time I'm like, it's a no. And then the third time I start to power up a little bit. But if someone pushes against a boundary 4 or 5 times, I do become angry. And what I'm learning to do is just disengage more rapidly because that anger isn't serving me or them. Yeah. This is a person that isn't hearing my no, isn't willing to honor my needs and just keeps pushing. Yeah. And that's probably just coming out of their own neediness and their inability to resource themselves. But that's kind of tough to relate to.
Exactly. Yeah. And I love how you speak into that, you know, even if that person doesn't honor your, you know, expression or boundary in that moment or your limitation, you can still stay in an empowered position where you just decide to disengage, even if the person cannot actually honor your request.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And I've been loving this opportunity to just take space for me and hold me in that as well. Yeah. And look, to be clear as well, like there's been many occasions where I've received no's and they've been really tough to receive, either the way they've been delivered or the energetic that's behind them. I've had to really learn to sit in and with that and hold myself in those and sit in the rejection of the no, and especially in physical intimacy, like that's been really tough. During times of like, you know, when Jess was pregnant with Onyx as well, like that was really tough for me to receive that. And you know, pregnant women are well within their right to say no to men. They're like growing a human. And that was something that I really had to learn, and it was tough.
I can 100% connect to this in so many ways. And it was really humbling in those moments, you know, it as well required me to as well look at myself, like where am I demanding that another person is meeting my needs?
Sure.
And as well, just being with that tender part of me that is actually, just there. But there's a gift in that, and to a degree, because it allows us to build a relationship to that tender part that is constantly hidden within that person maybe meeting that need, right?
Yeah, exactly. Look, if we keep entering into the codependency, they're enabling us to not actually hold ourselves. They're not serving us. So what I come to recognize is there's a gift in the no. And if I hear that gift, if I hear the no, and then I reflect on like, is this a need or a want? And then I go, okay, well, this is a need. How else do I meet it? Well, I'm gonna meet it somewhere else, right? And that becomes particularly sticky with this desire for physical intimacy and connection, where as men, categorically, we need to be able to move our own sexual energy on our own. Otherwise, we're gonna continue to be easily weaponized and manipulated by sexual energy from women, and that's on us. We got to learn that, and that's been a really great lesson for me.
Okay, this is such an important topic. I would love to get into it, but for time's sake, we won't be able to. But I had as well another conversation with a mutual friend, Alex Grundy, where we spoke quite deeply about that and the importance of that. And I just highly stand by, you know, what you just said and the importance of that and self-sourcing ourselves versus, like imposing that imposing that our needs are met, by another by outsourcing them.
Yeah, there's a neediness in sexual relations doesn't feel very good for me.
Absolutely. It's not inviting.
Yeah, maybe anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And maybe there was a time where I kind of enjoyed that quality
Sure.
was coming alive in women there, where they were like, there's a hunger or a neediness there. But I think that doesn't appeal to me anymore. Yeah, because it's probably going to lead to some quality of dependency on me to provide them with that, which is going to be likely exhausting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To close off this conversation, it's been such a rich conversation where we went into so many different topics, and to a certain degree, there is this, joyful sense of overwhelm in the sense that I just want to speak longer with you.
Yeah, sure, man. We can go for hours.
But I really feel like I can't leave this conversation without speaking about, your relationship to Onyx and speaking as well about fatherhood. And
thank you, bro.
I saw this beautiful Instagram story that you shared today that, where you had a photo with your son, and you were sharing about how it's such a gift for you to really be the father for your son that you never had.
Yeah.
I would, if you're open to it, I would love for you just to speak a little bit more about that and how stepping into fatherhood has shaped you.
Yeah, thank you, bro. Yeah, it's been really tough. Yeah, honestly, it's been really difficult. Without going into too much information on certain elements, because I want to respect Jess, Onyx's mum. I'm a 42-year-old co-parenting dad, and I find myself in this very interesting chapter in my life. And ultimately, to be a father currently in our culture and society, for me at least, is challenging on a number of different levels. And so, I mean, you saw my Instagram story because it's on my close friends. So I don't share things about Onyx publicly, right? So that's one thing where it's like, there's a lot of kind of backlash towards fathers in general. So I think the first thing that I really had to confront was my own relationship to my father, which I reconciled. I hadn't been in touch with my father for about a decade. And when I found out I was going to be a father, I reconnected with him. And I started to hear a little bit more about his experience and his stories and his challenge that he faced in being a father. And I had a desire to do things differently. My parents divorced when I was 3.5, and my father essentially moved away and remarried and had 3 kids and essentially started a new family. And I never really blamed him for that. I really understood why he did that. And in reconnecting to him, I had a much deeper understanding of why he did that. And unfortunately, I was faced with the exact same challenge for reasons I won't state publicly, but Jess and I chose to separate and move to Bali and co-parent. And so I found myself facing the same situation where this child, this son, who I cared very much for and was obviously projecting a lot of my own story onto, I made a decision that I would be there for him. And I've been advocating sometimes fiercely for that. I see Onyx 6 days a week. And I got to wake up with him this morning. It's taken 3.5 years for him to be able to stay the night with me due to co-sleeping and breastfeeding. And so I've rewritten that story. I have been there for him in the way that my father wasn't, and I will continue to do that. And what that has meant is, on the one hand, there's been sacrifice and continues to be. And I love that. And this is where, again, what I'm sacrificing is so worth it for these moments of seeing him healthy. And I think I just put such a value on legacy. His ability to meet his wants and needs and his patterns of behavior are a direct reflection of how he's been relating to me and his mum and society more broadly. I, as a father, I think, it was a really big wake up where it was like, I had to step out of Peter Panning and start to really stare down the responsibility of what it meant to provide in a variety of different ways for a human. And I think, if it was a daughter, the projection would have been same but different. But because it's a son, it's really strong, right? And what that means is I don't want him to experience my pain and suffering. That brings up a lot. I want him to experience freedom and love and joy and connection. And what that means is I had to to be able to meet him in that I had to take a really big inventory of myself and my life. And he's a pretty clear mirror. He shows me where I'm still got a lot of work to do, you know, in terms of the way I relate and my emotional sensitivity / control. Yeah, kids are great at pushing buttons and finding boundaries. So yeah, I've really enjoyed holding steady with him, to him around certain things. And I love explaining things to him. He works really well with logic and reasoning, and children are just incredibly intelligent, you know?
Yeah, in these 2 years that I know you, it's been incredibly inspiring me. For me to see how you were relating to your son and how as well devotional and committed you are to spend time with him and to be with him, right? And I do recognize it comes at, I guess, at a certain cost, you know, to, you know, time that you would have maybe for yourself. But like, I can just see like you were just so dedicated to that, and I've always admired that quality in you.
Thank you, bro.
So yeah, I just want to express that out to you. And yeah, I'm curious to hear, what do you believe is the thing that Onyx really taught you, or what are some of those biggest lessons that he has been teaching you?
Well, I think the biggest one is that he's infinitely wise, and I got to stay out the way. Yeah. Right. So, you know, humans have a desire for love and freedom, naturally hardwired in them, and want to thrive. And it's only in my getting in the way of that that I would create something that really needs to be addressed later in life. And so what that means is, like, as a dad, I kind of think that like most of my responsibility revolves around stopping him from falling off things that are high. Like, that's kind of like, it's like, and then with that as well, just like acknowledging that, like, there's this quality of a good enough parent. Like, I don't want to polarize. I don't want him to never have discomfort. I don't want him to always have joy. You know, life is going to give us these teachings. And I think presence, like consistent presence, like he's quite often just there, really there with me. An abundance of energy, which has meant that I've, you know, for a variety of different reasons, I've changed a lot of lifestyle factors for me around, alcohol consumption 0. I modulate my sleep. I'm very mindful about diet. These are reasons, and movement as well, I've paid a lot more attention to. I want to be able to stay active and vibrant with him. And that's very motivational. I want to, give him the opportunity to learn how to surf if he wants to, and be there for him in those situations. So there's a lot of things that this young man who's really vibrant, who's coming in, he's almost 4.5 now, and I'm 42. And it's just like, shit, like I got to take care of myself if I really want to share these experiences with him. And so, yeah, I do. I really want to share those experiences with him. So I think, he's taught me a lot about presence, also innocence, you know, because ultimately he's operating out of a space of innocence. And so it's allowed me to recognize there are these certain qualities that he has in human behavior that he will use, or he will attempt to use, to get his needs met out of pure innocence. And when I explain to him there's a different way, he will adopt it. And what I've noticed is, if I meet him in a way that I'm listening and that I care, he knows that he doesn't have to shout or manipulate or do any of those other things. And so I hope that I can show that to more and more people, and especially bring that more deeply into a new potential romantic relationship, where I can actually show up and show genuine presence and compassion, and show that other person that any of their patterns or adaptation that they have, they don't need anymore.
And this is such a gift, I imagine, to so many, you know, parents, you know, just hearing what you said, you know, and as well, it really speaks as well into this good-hearted nature that we all have, you know, this good-hearted nature.
Yes.
That we're not here to do harm or to wrong, right? And it's just this, I guess being with him and just sharing with him, there is another way that he actually wants to do that.
Yes.
Right? But there is maybe a level of ignorance or naivete that is present, you know, which is of course understandable as a child, you know, that we can't bypass, I guess. And we have to work with.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the teaching, the things that I'm teaching him by being and by him watching me. And if I relate with compassion to him, he relates with compassion to me. As he's getting a little older, I'm starting to request more of him in reasonable ways. Like, so there's an Inuit saying that you know, that white people have a tendency to basically overestimate emotional capacity and underestimate physical capacity.
Interesting.
And what that means is we assume that our children aren't physically capable, but are emotionally capable. And I like that. And so what that means is, to reverse that, I test him more physically and still acknowledge that he's quite young emotionally and or mentally. And so I ask him now to help me, like, you know, he offers now, but initially I asked him to help me carry things for dinner. And now he'll come over and he'll start setting the table. And he starts to have a sense of, like, you know, gratitude and appreciation for what we're doing. We're co-creating now. And it's not that, like, you know, I think he's more helpful, you know, in that sense and in that way. So I think that's been really fun as well.
What do you believe is one message that you would like to pass on to your son? Or would you, like if you envision your son stepping into maturity, stepping as well into adulthood, what is it that you would like to leave him with? Maybe an understanding, a way of living.
Yeah, I think it comes back to what we were exploring around the magnitude of relationship. It's to continue to explore how things are in relationship. And it's not that there's like a static lesson that's learned. It's like, let's just keep learning. And as he's 4.5, next year there's a whole new set of lessons for me, you know, next week even. But it's this idea that, like, we're continually learning. One thing with Onyx, you know, I'm learning to be a parent. He's not learning to be a child. He's just being. And so
I love that.
I have to learn how to be a parent. He just has to be.
That's so fascinating, because it feels so, like, opposing to what I feel like I've been taught. It's like I'm being reprimanded for being a child.
No, yeah,
growing up, you know, that's
and
he's
just reminding me how I ought to be living.
Yeah.
He's the one teaching me, and I'm stopping him from falling off tall things and you know, creating spaces of safety. So I think I suppose if I could embody that in him, and he would really feel and believe in that, then he would do the same for his children if he chooses to have them. That's probably going to be the biggest gift I could give him in terms of legacy.
So it sounds like you supporting him is actually more about you embodying more of what he's already, like, living so innately.
Yeah, and this is a remembering and unlearning. It's coming back to the childlike qualities with responsibility.
Beautiful, brother. Man, this conversation has been absolutely epic.
So epic, brother.
We've gone into so many different subject matters, and I mean, I would definitely love to have you back in the future. And there's so many other things that we never really had a chance to get into.
Sure, I mean, I would love to come back and maybe even explore a little bit more around being a father, or also some of the elements we touched into around sexuality and relationship. I think those are both really exciting to discuss
100%.
more.
And that's, I mean, you know, these are things that I'm as well continuously exploring. So
yes,
that would be something that I'd be very interested in. I would love to leave on a final note with a question in regards to, I mean, first of all, the thing that I really love to explore is that, to a certain degree, the quality of the life that we live is at times predicated around the quality of the questions that we ask ourselves and that we explore continuously within our lives. I'm wondering, what is one question that you would like to leave our listeners with that they may be able to support within their life? And I'm wondering, so that would be the first part. And the second part would be, based on the conversation that we've had over the last 2 hours, what is one message that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, so thank you, bro. The one question that I would like everyone to ask themselves on a continuum is, how am I breathing? And the how is, like, in this moment, how am I breathing? So observation of that, but also, how am I breathing? It's to actually understand a little bit more about breath mechanics. What's going on inside my body? And so I think that is the contemplation of, what is this meat suit that I'm in? So that's the one question.
Incredibly potent question.
And what was the other part?
The second part is based on the conversation that we've had over the last 2 hours. What is one underlying message that you feel has been really important to you, that you feel like you would like to just pass on to our listeners?
I think it would be around compassion. And it would be around this idea that both us, like we, me, I, and everyone around us, we're all doing the best that we can with what we have. and the information that we have and the levels of awareness that we have at the time. And so it's that continued lens of innocence that we can view others through. And that would be my sort of, my message would be like, let's just continue to have compassion with self-responsibility and compassion whilst holding others accountable.
I love that. And I love as well how it's framed within that tension, with responsibility. And I mean, just speaking into it quite shortly, tapping into compassion has been really one of the most potent paths towards my healing journey, because the very strong ingrained pattern was, for me, self-judgment, right? And being incredibly harsh to myself. And so to find a new way and to actually discover that innocence, that good-hearted nature that you see in your own child, and really witness that as well in myself, that I don't want to do harm.
Thank you.
I want to do good. And I know I'm speaking about myself right now, but I want to really speak into the listener here, and for them to understand that, hey, like we're just doing the best that we can.
Thank you, bro.
And at the same time as well, holding, of course, that tension between responsibility as well.
Yeah, because I think, if we're on the spectrum of having too much self-responsibility, then without the compassion, that's when that critical self-judgment really can come up. So holding both of those simultaneously. And I've witnessed you come into this beautiful space of self-compassion. Even, the way that you teach and the way that you speak, there's just a lot more sort of ease and spaciousness that's come alive in acknowledging your own humanity.
Thank you so much, brother.
So good.
All right. Well, I would like to just close off this conversation and just asking you, where can our listeners find you?
Thank you, bro. I think in the dreaded and wonderful Instagram. So you can just go to Edward Dangerfield. It's just my name.
Yeah.
And that's probably the easiest and best way to engage with me. I've been a little bit more inspired there recently.
Beautiful. I'll make sure as well to, just put the link as well in the show notes. Is there any interesting projects, any interesting coming up that you would like to bring our listeners to awareness to?
I think following Breath Lab would be interesting.
Okay.
So Breath Lab, you can find it through me, or just find it there as well on Instagram. Partnered with Satori Clark, who's just a part of Breathwork Bali and FBR as well. And what we're exploring, and it's going to be a long journey, is mapping brain function to breathing rhythm. So but definitely Satori's a little bit more skeptical in a healthy way, but I have a belief that as we map some of the breathing rhythms, we're going to find that they elicit very specific brain functions and very specific emotional responses. And I strongly believe that if we get clearer at decoding breathing rhythms, we're going to be able to create new pathways for really great mental and emotional health.
Yeah, that's definitely a very revolutionary, path forward, So thank you. Edward, I mean, I've already expressed it, but just so much appreciation, so much gratitude for you, and like having known you now for 2 years, and kind of starting off in this mentor-teacher relationship, and moving into deeper friendship, especially over the last 1.5 years, has been such a blessing. And just deeply want to thank you.
Thank you
for being
so
such
much,
a friend, and continuously being able to learn from you.
Yeah, it's been a really great conversation to be here, and I think there's so many more that we'll have in the future. And a lot of love and appreciation for you, bro. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and to our listeners, thank you all for coming in. Thank you for dropping into this podcast. I hope you received value. And until next time, much love. Thank you for listening to this episode. Your time and attention is truly appreciated. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to subscribe to stay tuned for my upcoming episodes. And in case you know somebody who would find this episode helpful, I encourage you to pay it forward. Finally, if you've personally been receiving value from the show, one way you're able to support this podcast is by leaving a 5-star rating and a written review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Not only does this help more people find the show, but it also supports me in bringing more incredible guests on for the future. I'm your host, Alex Lehman, and until next time, signing off.